The Australian Financial Review.
Lawlessness, corruption and violence.
The CFMEU finds itself with very few friends tonight.
The fallout was immediate. Sweeping reforms were promised.
This week marks a year since the Building Bad investigation exposed the construction union's deep links to organised crime. It revealed bikies and gangsters had infiltrated construction projects, taken on lucrative CFMEU jobs, and sent menacing messages to those who spoke out. Following the reports, the Albanese government placed the union into administration. But 12 months on, federal and state governments are still struggling to re-establish the rule of law in the construction industry.
And I'm standing there in the protest in the middle of them, and the union officials are taking the stand, and they're screaming about how the media are the criminals, which meant me, of course.
Welcome to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray. This week, workplace correspondent David Marin-Guzman on what has been done to stamp out corruption in the building sector and whether it's working. It's Thursday, July 10. Hi Dave, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Dave, it's been a year since the Building Bad investigation lifted the lid on what's happening in the construction industry, this culture of fear and intimidation. Remind us again what you and your colleagues at the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age uncovered.
Yeah, it has been a year. It feels like much longer than that. And we've got 2 more years of what is effectively a forced administration of the CFMEU to go. So a lot more to still happen, I think. But just to give you a recap.
The workers united will never be defeated.
The main revelation that came from our 9-month investigation was that underworld figures had effectively infiltrated major Victorian and New South Wales construction projects and the construction union itself.
The CFMEU is in a spin about corruption allegations levelled against it.
You had a lot of former senior bikies appointed in very cushy but powerful delegate jobs with the union.
The CFMEU is being accused of handing lucrative taxpayer-funded construction jobs to members of outlaw motorcycle gangs.
You had firms backed by underworld figures being given CFMEU enterprise bargaining agreements, which in the construction industry, they're the prize.
Reports the union has been infiltrated by organised crime has prompted the shock resignation of its controversial leader John Setka months earlier than planned.
Once a builder signs that, once a contractor signs that, gives them access to big, lucrative commercial building projects, big government-paid infrastructure projects, they're handed out by the union and controlled very closely by the union.
The biggest union is CFMEU. They don't give out EBAs that easy. And the reason why is because they control the market. The big build is theirs. You can't get in if you don't know someone. Not going to happen.
We had recording secret surveillance of a self-styled construction fixer who was offering building subcontractors CFMEU EBAs for a lot of money.
There's a fee to get the EBA.
Yeah.
I think the upfront fee is cash. But all you got to do, I told you, pay the boys, make sure they're okay, and that's it. That's the business. And everybody eats.
We also revealed video footage of John Setka, the leader of the Victorian branch, making a menacing nighttime visit to a fellow union official who had spoken up against the union. He dumped a suitcase scrawled with a message attacking the official as a dog.
What message was that sending? You speak out against us, we know where you are, and we can get to you.
I say union, you say
There was footage of union officials engaged in standover tactics of a small Indigenous labour hire company threatening to rip their head off.
Rat. But declared your dog in front of the boys, what are you going to do about it?
Nothing.
You know what, Danny? You've got no heart, mate. You won't fight for the fucking boys.
We fight for them.
And there were recordings of a CFMEU official boasting that the union secretly controlled this $100 billion big build program that the Victorian government had for road and rail infrastructure projects. That the union effectively could black ban companies from government sites that it did not like.
We've got EBAs, we've got McConnell, Dal, Foot, Logan, CPB, we've got them all.
We wanted to
work with them. And you won't be coming in with our companies.
I say union, you say power. Thank you, brothers and sisters. We love you all.
So that's quite the list of revelations. What was the response after the series was published?
So we'd sent questions to the union and to Setka about the allegations that we were going to be reporting on the day before. And at about 5 o'clock on the Friday, before the articles had been published, Setka announced his resignation.
Tough guy John Setka has never backed down from a fight until now.
I'm just sick of all the stories. I'm sick of all the false allegations, and I'm sure the members are too.
And then we saw the Labor government effectively introduce legislation to force the union into administration.
Good morning. We begin with breaking news from Canberra this morning. The government has announced the CFMEU will be placed into administration and the Federal Police will investigate its officials.
And he had Mark Irving, a former industrial barrister, taking control of the union as its appointed administrator. Basically, in less than a month, the whole construction division effectively was put into administration. You had about 200 unpaid officials forced out of their jobs. You had 11 paid senior officials being forced out of their jobs. That was within the space of weeks. You had also the start of, criticism of the administration as well, of being perhaps too timid in acting against some of the organisers or some of the delegates that were left over from this purge that had happened during the administration. So effectively being accused of cutting off the head but leaving the tentacles intact.
And Dave, there has been a lot of opposition to the administration, not just with the loyalists, but across the union. There have been protests across the country. Who's protesting and why?
Yeah, so immediately I think when you had the administration legislation brought in, the construction division forced into administration, these officials ousted, you had mass protests by construction workers.
Tens of thousands of construction workers walked off the job in protest at the federal government.
Joining the CFMEU. It was tools down for tens of thousands of tradies today, marching off the job and
loud and proud, wearing their CFMEU shirts, waving their flag.
Thousands of workers been brought out in protest over this forced administration.
We built this city!
Do you think the CFMEU is in trouble, though? There were problems?
Look at the numbers, mate. Doesn't look like trouble to me, mate.
Their criticism was that, well, these are allegations yet to be tested in court. And I think the concern was that this was potentially precedent-setting legislation, that you could have other militant unions, whether it was the Maritime Union or other building unions, put into administration through legislation, whether it was the Coalition or Labor. So you had that initial burst of protests, particularly in Victoria, but it was relatively quickly to end in Victoria. In New South Wales, it continued almost month after month. I went to those protests, every one in New South Wales. And by that point, people are recognising me. They know who I am, I think. You get the kind of tap on the shoulder and you look behind and, no one's there. But it signals they know who you are. And I'm standing there in the protest in the middle of them, and the union officials are taking the stand, and they're screaming about how the media are the criminals, which meant me, of course. In Queensland, you also had some protests as well. Queensland's slightly different because there were not any real specific corruption allegations against them, and they are almost the last holdout.
And there was some political fallout in the election.
Yeah, well, one of the political parties who strongly backed the protesters and opposed the administration laws was the Greens, particularly Federal Greens MP, or former Federal Greens MP now, Max Chandler-Mather, in Queensland, who attended the protests and stood up for the ousted CFMEU officials. He ended up losing his seat in the last federal election, and some said the CFMEU Association contributed to the drop in support for those Green MPs. So that was some of the political fallout. Labor seems to have seen this actually as a benefit politically. It doesn't seem to have seen this as affecting its chances. And if you're going to judge by the federal election result, which they won with a landslide, it may have even helped them.
In some ways, they've been able to distance themselves from this more unpalatable segment of the union movement.
It's always been a problem for them, so they're uttering a sigh of relief.
So, despite the opposition, do you think the administrator has been effective?
Well, the administrator, Mark Irving, would tell you, and did tell Parliament, that he was stymied because the ousted officials, after their ousting, launched a High Court challenge to the administration laws. Now, the administrator said, well, I've got to wait for this High Court challenge before I can really take action. That didn't stop them, frankly, from doing some terminations and continuing their investigations. So there was this criticism of the administration that was simultaneously decisive in some areas, but also very timid in other areas. The result being there was a mixed message coming out to the industry that basically things weren't really going to change. There was this hope initially after the administration that, wow, this could really lead to a change we have not expected in 50 years. And now we're getting the mixed messages. We saw some of the same behaviour continue even after the administration. So in New South Wales, you had a lot of delegates closely aligned with the former leader, Darren Greenfield. We even photographed one of the delegates meeting Darren Greenfield secretly in a morning meeting before they started work. So yeah, even though he's ousted, he's still giving instructions to these delegates on how to do their work, what companies to let on or what companies to push off. You had a CFMEU organiser, his car was firebombed after he scrutinised a contractor over their safety and compliance, a contractor with alleged underworld connections. And so that culture of fear is still there. It was a sign that perhaps the administration wasn't as strong or wasn't as decisive as it should have been. So you still had this problem that the High Court challenge, which taking months to decide, had effectively left a lot of stuff in limbo. And so you had that perception that the old regime could return. If they won that High Court challenge, the whole thing could be neutered. So the administrator, in that sense, couldn't really make any big decisions until that decision was handed down. And so, Lisa, last month, the High Court unanimously rejected that challenge to the legitimacy of the administration laws. And that means that there are no excuses left for the administrator.
Dave, we're talking about what has happened in the years since the Building Bad investigation exposed corruption and underworld infiltration of the CFMEU and the construction industry. An administrator was appointed to the union in the wake of the series, and last month the High Court rejected a challenge to the legitimacy of that administration. What was that case all about, and what does this decision mean for the administrator?
So the case was a constitutional challenge to the administration laws that Labor specifically brought in to put the union into administration. So it raised questions of, was this a breach of the implied freedom of political communication, which is a sort of implied right in our constitution about freedom of political speech. It raised questions about the separation of powers. Is sort of effectively the Parliament or the executive acting as in the place of the courts in its role of punishment. Did it amount to taking union property without just terms compensation? Probably most significant was the political communication question. There were officials that were told not to speak anymore during, say, state or territory elections. As well, the administrator promised as part of the passage of the legislation and the vote in support by the coalition that he would ban donations or any political donations by the CFMEU or political campaigning. There was a promise that was made in the side letter. It wasn't actually in the legislation. So this is a challenge backed by the blue-collar unions. They spent a lot of money on this, several hundreds of thousands of dollars, mainly because they feared that this legislation would operate as a precedent to put other militant unions, whether they be the Maritime Union or the Electrical Trades Union, into administration. The problem was that, I guess, when this legal action was ongoing, and we're talking about 10 months or 9 months, that a lot of the workers, construction workers, and some of the ousted officials just didn't take the administration seriously. There was that impression, well, there's a chance that the old leadership will return. So when this decision was taken down, it really drew a line in the sand. It really marked the end of this old regime, the Darren Greenfields, the Setka kind of leadership, and ultimately forced, I think, even people who criticised or opposed the administration to just accept, look, this is what we have to deal with. And look, there still exists an opposition to the administration, but I think it's growing weaker. This is a real line in the sand, and they've got to move forward.
So the legal impediment has been removed, but there are still challenges for the administration, aren't there?
Yeah, you've got like a lot of these old corrupt building companies, they're still working in the industry. These are the corrupt contractors that a lot of, say, the delegates or the officials were backing to get onto government sites. There was and a lot of these in Victoria, bikie delegates who benefited from their powerful positions. They're still operating on the sidelines, and some of them are fighting back. Some of these companies are fighting back. You had a CFMEU New South Wales organiser's house who was graffitied with slurs, his car firebombed, his family absolutely petrified by, we don't know who, but he was acting against a subcontractor with alleged underworld links who may have been connected to the firebombing, we think. We have firebombing between earth-moving companies in Victoria, literally just day after day over several weeks, months in fact, where earth movers were set alight, even company offices were blown up. Really because the attention now becomes between those kind of underworld companies. Once they've lost the union as their way onto these sites, they just have to deal with their competition like the law of the jungle in a way. The focus in some ways shifting to the corrupt elements within this industry rather than just the union itself. And it's important to remember that actually over the last sort of 11 months, 12 months, really, you've had actually a lot of high-profile exits from the administrator. The administrator has appointed several executive directors, he calls them, to man the state branches. Well, in Queensland, you had its first executive director retire after just a few months. In Victoria, you had the first executive director retire within weeks. In New South Wales, you had a senior person brought on to take charge of the union, quit within 7 days. These are the kind of exits that really destabilise an administration. And at the same time, you've got Mark Irving, the head administrator, who, he's in his late 50s, but he was taken to hospital earlier this year after experiencing chest pains. He's only recently back to work as part of a return to work program. So there's no doubt his doctors are telling him to avoid stressful situations.
I think he'd find it quite difficult to avoid stressful situations in this role. Dave, the immediate response to the Building Bad series was the resignation of John Setka, the CFMEU being put into administration, and the standing down of hundreds of union officials. But what's come of the investigations that were triggered by your reporting? What are some specific examples of cases that have been pursued?
So the Australian Federal Police, they set up Operation Rye last year to effectively investigate the allegations in our reports, allegations of criminality in the construction industry, including CFMEU officials receiving bribes for enterprise agreements to access major building sites. And if you recall, one of the key allegations in our reports was that there was these networks, I guess, that facilitated these alleged payments for CFMEU EBAs. There were recently AFP raids of an accountant linked to Victorian underworld figure Mick Gatto's circle. Really, this was in response to those alleged payments of thousands of dollars for enterprise agreements. Now, no charges have been laid against this accountant. This investigation is still ongoing, but I think that those raids were a very key development in the AFP's investigation. In South Australia, the leader of the CFMEU there, Marcus Paré, was investigated by the administration. The investigation found that he had links with bikie figures. He allegedly got them work, including on the union's own renovations, helped them with agreements. He used the union credit card to basically lunch out or have dinner at the finest Adelaide restaurants. There were no charges pressed against him, but he has been banned from the union. It remains to be seen if there'll be any criminal charges in relation to that at all. And then there have been charges laid in relation to the CFMEU organiser who threatened the owner of an Indigenous labour hire firm and was recorded saying he's going to tear that person's head off. He's been charged with making death threats and is still in the courts at the moment. I think he is denying the charges. And finally, there was the case of the former New South Wales boss, Darren Greenfield.
So let's talk about Greenfield, because while much of your investigation was focused on the CFMEU in Victoria, he was really a central character in this story. And in the past year, much more detail has come to light about his activities. Tell us about the revelations of under-the-table bribes involving Greenfield and his son.
So it's important to say these allegations first sort of emerged back in 2021. He was charged with this back then, and essentially for the last 4 years he's been denying the claims and trying to plead not guilty. But what we uncovered in our Building Bad reports was that we showed images from secret police surveillance of Darren Greenfield literally taking cash bribes under the table from a subcontractor inside the union offices and then taking that money and trying to hide it in a desk under his office. It really laid bare what really should have been apparent already to, I think, that union. There was serious evidence here of corruption. Yet what was uncovered in the administration after our articles was that the union had spent almost $1 million trying to defend this case. And this is a case that had not had any real substantial hearings. I was there for most of it. You had minor procedural matters over evidence, but nothing really justifying that I could see over almost $1 million spent of union members' money. To top it off, the administration found that just days before the union went into administration, they got the Committee of Management to approve $3 million of union members' money to go to his lawyer who was defending the case, ostensibly to pay for future legal fees. Now, the administration managed to claw that back. That $3 million is back with the union. But even so, you're talking about substantial amounts of union members' money that's been paid for a case that he pleaded guilty to. He has recently, this year, pleaded guilty to the charges of taking bribes from the employers. You're talking about, if you count him and his deputy official, who was his son, they both pleaded to taking bribes about 6 times over 3 years, cash under the table, envelopes of money shoved into their pockets, free home renovations, bottles of wine. So it really showed, I think, that this corruption within the CFMEU extended all the way to the top. And that, I think, was a real eye-opener for much of the movement, some of which still denied that Greenfield was corrupt, that there was any reason to put, say, the New South Wales branch into administration.
And so, Dave, they'll be sentenced later this year?
So Darren and his son Michael, they're going to be back in the courts in November, and hopefully we're going to get a sentencing decision probably by the end of the year. But at the moment, they're out on bail, but with no leadership position in any union.
So then, finally, Dave, is the building industry any cleaner than it was 12 months ago? And now that the administration is clear of the legal challenge, how much progress do you think can be made over the next year or years ahead?
Well, it's a complicated question, I think. I don't think the administration alone is going to tackle corruption, and that's what's really coming into focus now. The construction industry, like a lot of construction industries around the world, it is always going to have a corrupt element, or it commonly does have a corrupt element. Usually rises to prominence probably in cycles. And I think it reached its peak again in this decade. And the CFMEU is a gatekeeper to a lot of these projects. That's why it was such a target for corruption. And the fact these leaders did not stop that corruption, and in some cases were party to the corruption, is a real indictment on them, because ultimately the underworld was able to use and abuse what should be legitimate construction unions working for members, working for safety standards in the industry, working to weed out these dodgy subcontractors. But the problem still remains. You still have this sort of underworld contingent that is still, these are some of the biggest companies in the construction industry. But it's about tackling the core problem, and I think ultimately you probably do need some sort of Australian Federal Police permanent industry task force to keep an eye on this. You also need, frankly, the governments to really back this clean out. The administrator, it's got to do a cleanup, and it is doing that. You've seen just in the last few weeks, you've seen organisers aligned with the old guard being effectively forced to resign or terminated. Others been offered termination payouts to get rid of this old guard and bring in the new. So it's been a year since our initial reporting, so you give it the benefit of the doubt. They want this High Court decision. Now they do seem to be more outspoken. They do seem to be more decisive. Let's see how they go for another 2 years of that, I suppose.
Thanks, Dave. Thanks for coming on the podcast and giving us the update.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to The Fin. I'm Lisa Murray, with Financial Review workplace correspondent David Marin-Guzman joining the podcast today. The Fin is produced by Alex Gow with assistance from Mandy Coulin. Fiona Buffini is head of premium content. Our theme is by Alex Gow. If you like the show and want to hear more, follow us wherever you get your podcasts and consider rating and reviewing us as it helps others find us. For more stories about markets, business and power, subscribe to the Financial Review at afr.com/subscribe. See you next week.
The Australian Financial Review.